Good morning, everyone. We appreciate you to welcome you to our webinar with ECT, Environmental Consulting and Technology. Today's webinar is Restoration of Headwater Streams. I have with me Rob Mailoya, and he will be presenting on the stream restoration component, and I'll present on some of the green stormer infrastructure that's part of the water quality that helps out in the stream restoration efforts. For those that are just joining, please mute, and as well, we'll take questions into the chat that's in the upper right-hand corner of the webinar um, software there. This is being recorded, so we'll be able to send those out to whoever has the desire to listen again to us. As I mentioned, I'm Patrick Judd. I am the Senior Manager of the Integrated Site and Engineering Studio here at ECT. Rob is Senior Water Resource Scientist out of our Water Resource Engineering service line. Next, please. ECT by the numbers. We have worked in 22 states. We're 100% employee owned. We have 20% of our employees have masters or PhDs. We've consistently been in the top 200 environmental news magazine for 24 years. We've been able to acquire $200 million in grants for our projects and clients, and we have 30 plus years of service. Next, please. Our locations, our majority of our offices are in Florida and Michigan. We're headquartered in Gainesville, Florida, and we've worked in most of the states that you see throughout the country for our several service lines. Next, please. Our capabilities are compliance and sustainability, natural resources, site assessment and remediation, as well as water resources. Next, please. Specific to our interdisciplinary team in the Landscape Architectural Integrated Engineering Studio, we do have those services that are provided as part of the site assessment, workshops, site development, shoreline and water systems design, civil and water resource engineer, as well as ecological resources services for the natural areas, wetland delineation and monitoring. Next, please. So what I'm going to do is turn it over to Rob, who will start you off with restoration of the headwater streams, and the agenda is there so you can see as we go through this presentation what to expect. And I'll turn it over to Rob.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. So we're going to try to keep this fairly informal. You know, if questions arise, I'll try to address some of them, and we'll have more of a discussion toward the end as we switch between the two different presentations, but feel free to ask questions as we go. Our thought here was to provide some information to people. You know, this may be the first of several future webinars. If we've got enough interest, let us know if there's future topics that you'd like us to address. And, you know, we're going to have a good discussion today, hopefully, on the restoration of headwater streams, talk about some historical impacts that we've had in Michigan on some of those systems, our methodology for going through stream assessment, which is really one of the keys to effective design, some of the different solutions that we may have that are particular to headwater streams, a couple of quick case studies to show you what we're specifically talking about, and then lead into some more broader planning strategies at the subwatershed scale that really overlap really well with a lot of the green infrastructure work that Patrick's group does. So next slide. So what are we talking about when we're discussing these smaller headwater streams. There's a couple different ways to classify them. One easy way to look at it is by using a concept of stream order. There's a couple different classification mechanisms, the Strahler one being one of the more popular, where two first order streams merge together to form a second order stream, and two second order streams merge together to form a third order stream. And, this is a very simplified way, but it gives you an idea. What we're talking about today is really the first and second order streams. Exactly where that breakoff point is kind of arbitrary, but it gives you an idea of the type of scale that we're talking about. Usually something less than 2 square miles of drainage area, and sometimes up to 5 or 10 square miles, but these smaller tributaries can actually be fairly dry during parts of the season. Next slide. So the other way to classify these types of streams is hydrologically. Perennial streams that have constant flow. It's difficult. It's very watershed specific in Michigan, where that starts and stops. One watershed, plan that I worked on years ago, we found that it was around a half square mile drainage area where you started to get perennial flow, but even then it would become intermittent and dry up during parts of the year. And ephemeral streams are really the smallest streams that can be considered to have defined channel and banks, but only flow during snowmelt periods. And interesting study here showed that, what percentage of aquatic life is present in these compared to the perennial reaches. So it's this transitional zone that's really important in overall watershed health. And next. So what do these watershed, headwater systems do? They're intimately linked to our hill slopes and the upper parts of our watershed ridges, and they present sources to the stream network. They can provide water supply, especially during base flow conditions, during summer droughts. They can really help to moderate water temperatures, and they can help to assimilate a lot of nutrients and pollutants throughout the system. But because of their size, they can really become overwhelmed fairly quickly. And these systems can start to transport sediment for us, maybe, but some of our more urban systems are more sediment starved. And really, there's a transition here where we go from the smallest ephemeral streams to systems where the bed load just starts to be produced in the more moderate stream sizes, maybe second order streams, where they start to transition in stream type. And these systems, when they're functioning well, can transform a lot of nutrients, assimilate some of the pollutants in a watershed. They can help to reduce flood impacts and make our systems more resilient to changes in watershed conditions. Next slide. And this just gives you a quick idea of the overall scale of what we're talking about. So Michigan has a lot of stream miles, and what this figure here shows is that more than half of them in each watershed in Michigan are typically considered headwater streams, but this excludes streams of less than 1 mile in length. So really the total number of stream miles is probably close to double this if we factor in all the actual streams, storm sewers, and ditches and tributaries. Next slide. So I like this quote that I came across of a river's network is the circulatory system of the landscape, then headwater streams are like the small capillaries that fan out into larger veins and arteries. And really, that just helps to demonstrate the importance of these systems. Next. So it's a very good analogy. The circulatory system and even trees, provide this dendritic flow pattern to them. And this is common throughout nature. So just picture if you were to take one of the larger limbs of this tree, trim off all of the smallest branches, what would that do to the health of that part of the tree? And, you'd understand the importance of these smaller tributaries to overall health of our rivers. Next slide. So this was an interesting article that I came across recently. There's a link to it at the bottom here if you want to look at for, do a search for Scientific American article on stream revival, and they have a lot of interesting concepts in this article. And one of the main ones being the importance of this hypereic zone, the zone below the stream bed, which is really critical for overall stream health. And they refer to it here as the hidden gut of a stream, and had some interesting discussions about trying to restore that. And that's interesting because this is something we're incorporating into a lot of our designs now, the ability to not just, stabilize and revegetate stream banks, but also to look at the ability to reconstruct where necessary this stream bed, and even in terms of layering and things like that. So this article described a couple of recent studies where, most of the streams within some of these urban communities have been buried. And my assumption is in southern Michigan, at least, a lot of that is the case as well. And also in some of our more agricultural watersheds. And one of the takeaways of this is that, the scientists have shown how wide and deep a hypereic zone can reach within these streams. And the stream being studied here, Thornton Creek, they showed had this hypereic zone extending 30 feet from the stream channel into a depth of more than 3 feet. And in some of our more urban streams, we don't have bedrock, at least in this part of the state, for quite a ways down, but we do have like a real hard pan clay layer, and we start to get that stream bed sometimes down cutting right down to that clay layer. And in many urban streams, we see a veneer of 6 to 12 inches of sand and gravel that holds most of the biomass and aquatic life in those streams. So really, restoring that and the connectivity to the groundwater table in the adjacent floodplain is really critical. Next slide. So when we're doing master planning at, a sub-watershed scale, setting goals and objectives with our clients really important. One thing to consider in a lot of our stream projects, they're multi-objective. So we're achieving things like water quality benefits and flood reduction, similar to with the green stormwater infrastructure that Patrick's going to talk about. There's a lot of overlap between those, benefits. So when we put these two types of practices together, they can really be a lot of overall benefit. But just referencing the stream functions pyramid, there are certain controls that we have to try to provide what optimally at the top of the pyramid is the biology. A lot of cases that's restoring fisheries for a target species, but there's only so many things that we can really control. The geology at the bottom of the pyramid here is kind of set for us. The climate we can really only adapt to. And as we start going, the bottom layers of this stream functions pyramid kind of support the upper layers. So if we want improved ecology and water quality, really it starts with us trying to manipulate the stream morphology, the width, depth, slope, and those types of features of the actual stream channel and the stream corridor. And that obviously affects the ecohydraulics of the system. But normally in a larger river system, we can't do much about the watershed hydrology. And that's the difference with these headwater streams, with the types of Patrick's, the type of projects that Patrick's does, we can really start to improve the hydrology of some of these smaller systems, which can really help to, combined with the in-stream restoration, make a big difference in these systems. Next slide. So I think that one of the keys to effective design is really having a an appropriate quantitative assessment of the underlying causes of the problem so that your solutions are, fully addressing that. And I'm not going to go into this in big detail today, but this is mainly a quantitative comparative analysis that we do between a more functioning stable reference reach and our study reach. And this can be compared to, let's say, a water quality study. If we were to measure a dozen different water quality parameters, we can measure those numbers against standards or to an adjacent creek and try to figure out, how polluted is our stream. Well, this is very similar to doing a physical habitat assessment of river stability. We can measure the stream width and depth and slope and sinuosity, the materials, and probably 100 different parameters, and compare it to a reference reach and do this comparative or departure analysis. And we can quantify how unstable the stream is that we're working on. And really, it's more than just walking it, taking some photos with a clipboard and saying, this doesn't look good. We can put some numbers to it and determine, how bad is it and where do we focus our efforts. Okay, next slide. So processes. These are just some examples of some of the types of stream processes that we're talking about. And, over widening can occur, but if you tell me, your stream is 30 feet wide, I can't tell whether that's good or bad necessarily. But, if you tell me that you have a width to depth ratio of 10, the stream is 30 feet wide and 3 feet deep, that gives me a lot more information. And, knowing that part of the watershed and the scale that we're talking about, that sort of analysis can be really helpful. And so it's understanding these processes, what's going on. If you don't have active incision and down cutting going on, you probably don't need to spend the money on grade controls, for example. Okay, next slide. And there's a lot of different ways to quantify these functions. So we can do much more detailed studies that last years and years with replicate cross sections and bank pins and everything else, or we can do some more simple measurements that can be done in a day or two out in the field. And floodplain connectivity is a good example. We can look at bank height ratio, entrenchment ratio, and fairly easily quantify those things. But there are some more intensive measures that can be used depending on the type of study that you're doing, the level of funding available, and the overall timeline. Next study, or next slide. So this is a good example here, very simple example of a departure analysis that was done on a county drain. And this is the same stream, 100 yards apart, one upstream of a road crossing, the other downstream. And to the left, you can see a fairly narrow, maybe 3-foot wide channel with a clear gravel bottom, flowing fairly quickly through there. And it's relatively narrow and deep. And on the other side of the road, I think that a drain cleanout had been done at one point. The channel's probably 12 feet wide and maybe 6 inches deep. If you step into it, you sink up to your knee in anaerobic muck. And I would bet that, if you were to do biomonitoring out here, you'd have much different results between these two streams, and not because of non-point source pollution coming into, one reach versus the other, but because of the channel form and the morphology. And, so that raises a good question as we're doing biomonitoring on some of the streams that we look at, are we interpreting the data properly? Are we classifying those streams and collecting some basic information on stream morphology as well as land use and watershed conditions so we can interpret that data more effectively. Next slide. So real quickly, just looking at a typical longitudinal profile of a river, the only points I wanted to make here is it really depends where you're working within the watershed, and the sediment characteristics, hydraulics, and the overall processes involved. And in our area, in a lot of cases, the headwaters typically aren't mountainous like this. They're actually relatively flat. Take the Bell River, for example. The headwaters are historically a lot of flat wetland areas with wetland streams flowing through them. And, in the middle reaches, it's much higher gradient gravel and cobble with the best fisheries and mussel habitat, transitioning into more of a lacustrine area toward the St. Clair River. So, where you're working at within the watershed is an important consideration. Next slide. And one of the tools that we often use for dam removals, but also with our stream restoration project, is the concept of a geomorphic grade line. Where was the stream bed historically? And, in this case, in this tributary out west, I think that the channel had been straightened, relocated against the valley wall. All the willows were sprayed, and it downcut more than 10 feet. And the red line here is the historic grade line, which they ended up restoring it to and filling the channel back in to reconnect it to its floodplain. So this is a very important tool that we can look at and trying to evaluate, where the stream bed historically was, so that we can help reconnect it to the landscape and to the appropriate groundwater surface elevation. Next slide. And the geologic setting obviously is critical as well. This figure kind of shows you, based on stream valley type, characterizing how confined it is. A terraced alluvial valley might have typically a different stream type than more of a lacustrine type of valley that we have near Lake St. Clair, versus, some steeper, more narrow valley areas, which we have within some of our moraine features within the state. So characterizing that, helps you to evaluate the appropriate stream type that you're designing towards, and the landscape ecology. It's one thing to, restore some native prairie, for example, but if the landscape used to be bottomland hardwood, you want to know this landscape setting as part of your design as well. Next slide. So that gets us towards this concept of restoration master planning, which we're starting to do more and more of at the smaller subwatershed scale. I think that this is really helpful to have a lot of redundant practices in terms of groundwater infiltration and water quality BMPs that help to combine with in-stream practices to really help us eliminate TMDLs and to improve the health of our watersheds. And doing this at a smaller scale, really has some of the best potential. We want to start restoring watersheds themselves and miles of stream. And the way to get started with that is, successes at a smaller subwatershed level. But developing a plan, really helps to phase a project when you're talking about miles of stream, and helping to implement it, because you can have multiple landowners. And if they have a vision, then they're easier to get buy-in for implementation. And there's also economies of scale that can be done when you're trying to restore a quarter mile of stream versus a couple miles. You still have to do a lot of the same analysis and determining bankful characteristics and hydrology. And once you've done that for a smaller reach, you're able to scale that towards doing much more, and it makes for a better economy of scale for the design. Next slide. So there's a lot of different strategies that we can start to look at, really detail our project designs towards the targeted life species of brook trout, for example, and its various life stages, their critical food sources, providing habitat for that, and starting to look at the hydrology, how to store, slow, and infiltrate water within the actual stream corridor, and not just looking at the stream banks themselves. And looking at the overall valley form and function. And we try to use a lot of on-site materials as much as possible to avoid importing material in urban streams, that's not always possible. But it really helps to offset the cost and help us to do more and more miles. Next slide. So our approach to doing this is natural channel design, where we look to mimic the natural forms and functions of stable stream in their proper functioning condition. Next slide. So again, looking at this stream functions pyramid, Harmon had defined this, this ability for restoration potential. And, I think that that's an important consideration as well. In a lot of our streams and rivers, it's not possible to do full restoration. You're doing some sort of partial restoration or rehabilitation due to the site constraints. But where it is sometimes possible to do full restoration is at this headwater stream scale, where you can really address the hydrology and have control over the landscape there in order to properly reconnect it. It's very difficult for streams larger than 2 square miles of drainage area to fully do restoration. Next slide. So, of course, an important component of this is the connectivity of the system. We talked about the vertical connectivity to the stream bed, but there's also important lateral connectivity to the floodplain that we need to consider in having water on the landscape in terms of oxbows and vernal pools in the valley. Providing bank storage that can slowly seep back into the creek over time, and longitudinal connectivity, so you have fish passage and sediment flow from upstream to downstream has continuity. Next slide. So when we're talking about restoring incised streams, which are shown here in the red dash line, really deep, either dredged, channelized streams or streams that have downcut over a period of time, maybe below a dam or a weir, there are different priorities that Roskin's identified in a critical paper on different ways to restore incised channels. And priority 1 is probably, the best approach that you should look at first in most cases. And a lot of times that can involve raising the stream bed pretty significantly, or even abandoning the channel and remeandering a stream elsewhere on the floodplain, and partially filling this big gully that's formed, to either completely plugging it and filling it or creating off-channel wetlands with it. The other way is priority 2 is to excavate a floodplain, at a much lower elevation, but a lot of that depends on site constraints, like the elevation of a road culvert, for example. But really, one of the only areas where you can do a priority 1 restoration is in these headwater streams, especially in urban situations, to avoid flooding. So it's the first thing we want to look at in a lot of our streams because of the extensive benefits that it can provide, and the lower cost sometimes in terms of construction, rather than just trying to armor a channel in place. Next slide. So restoring floodplain connectivity, I talked about this a little bit. It may involve different methods. In some cases, if you have a good meander pattern within the channel, you can raise the bed up fairly easily by adding wood and natural gravel materials to raise the bed up, create some woody riffles, and it can be fairly cost effective. And other situations may be different, which I'll go into in a few other slides. Sometimes the valley may require groundwater dams. We have a lot of clay available in some of our more till-based stream systems, which can be mined and used for that purpose. And then you end up with an off-channel oxbow somewhere where you harvested that material. But it's becoming more and more important. We're looking at, reusing on-site topsoil, gravel, sand, clay, wood, and native sod mats as much as we can within our restorations to keep them as cost effective as possible and allow us to do more and more miles of restoration. Next slide. So in addition to historic dredging or downcutting, we can also have incised streams because of deposition that occurred either to an old mill dam, or in this case, they're showing because of historic agricultural practices from 100 years ago, and all this sediment has filled in the historic floodplain, and these legacy sediments need to be removed in order to restore it, like what's shown at the bottom slide. Here they're calling it cultural sediment, and I thought that this was an interesting article, just a figure to show it that incised channels may not be due to downcutting of the actual bed. It may be at its historic elevation, but sometimes these legacy sediments need to be managed as well. Next slide. And similarly to, rebuilding the stream bed in some locations, it can be necessary to rebuild some of the stream bank materials and floodplain materials. I've seen a lot of two-stage ditches excavated down to a subsoil, which really wasn't growing anything very well and doesn't provide that, groundwater connectivity to the stream as well as what can be done by rebuilding the soil profile within the floodplain, and a lot of this is done, as Patrick will probably describe, in urban watersheds as well. Next slide. So when we get to actually restoring some of these headwater stream channels, what we want to do is avoid just arbitrarily placing a lot of structures into them. When you have an inappropriate slope or channel width or plan form, and you've got, for example, these really sharp meander bends that are just going to get flanked and cut off over time. We don't want to try to anchor that in place. You're just going to be chasing this with more and more structures over time. They're going to fail and snowball, and you're going to be throwing, money at this for years to come. We really want to address the overall causes of instability and try to restore the dimensions, pattern, and profile of the stream as the first starting point. And then you need much less armoring and erosion control. The only place we do add armoring is where you have critical infrastructure, for example, at a sanitary manhole or at a road crossing, and it's important to protect that. Next. So here's an example of a small stream mitigation project worked on a few years ago. This is the before photo of a roadside ditch that was fed by a wetland upstream of here, is less than 1 square mile drainage area. But this channel was relocated to a wetland valley, maybe 100 feet or less to the east. So if you go to the next slide. So this is how it was restored, with a lot of these small oxbow ponds and vernal pools providing frog habitat next to this small channel, which was really only about 1 foot wide, 1 foot deep, and meandering through this former wetland area that was covered with invasives because of the altered hydrology here. Next slide. So what we were able to do is build this channel and allow it to vegetate over 1 or 2 growing seasons before we introduced any flow into it. So this is all groundwater that you see in these off-channel ponds and wetland pockets that were created adjacent to the channel. And next slide. And this is what the creek looked like. Like I said, it's very small, but there wasn't even, the flow hadn't even been redirected to this yet. This was after a couple growing seasons. Everything grew in, was well vegetated before we directed flow into it. And this allowed us to do this restoration without a lot of heavy erosion control blankets and expensive materials that really weren't necessary. There was a road culvert that was removed and the flows were diverted into this creek after a couple growing seasons, and the roadside ditch was just left in place for snow melt. Next slide. This is an example of another channel downstream of a small dam, actually. And so it had down cut about 4 feet over the years. The creek had been relocated up against this valley wall or this moraine feature, which was very typical in agricultural days. And it was straightened, but it caused a lot of bank erosion through here as well, hill slope failures. And you can see these utilities exposed along the bottom of the creek bed, showing how much it had downcut over time. And at first we looked at this and said, well, you know, we can stabilize these banks. We can build the creek back up 3 or 4 feet to reconnect it to its floodplain, and we can narrow up the stream. But trying to evaluate the cost of doing all that, and then we'd still have a straight stream flowing, you know, right up against this hill slope. So the best approach was just to abandon this creek altogether and redirect it into a meandering stream off into the floodplain that was about 0.8 feet deep, and it functioned much better when it's done. So next photo. So this is what we see sometimes in these incised systems. This schematic just shows an example of a gravel lens that you'll sometimes find halfway up a bank. And this is an actual photo of an incised section of the Clinton River near this project, where we found this gravel layer, and it had actually down cut through the clay hard pan layer down below by several feet, and you could tell that it had down cut, and this gravel exposed the elevation of where the stream bed used to be. So, you know, obviously this is going to create a lot of seeps and drain the whole landscape. That's the concept of our, you know, historical agricultural county drains, is that it drains the landscape. And by doing restoration, in the next slide, we're able to raise the bed back up and reconnect it to that. So all of the groundwater seeping back into the system, you know, is well connected again and drains back into the creek. These banks are less than a foot high, and when it does flood into this wider floodplain area, you get bank storage and things seeping back into the channel slowly over time. And that bank storage is kind of a natural way of getting extended detention within our natural streams by restoring function. Next slide. So this is image of where this creek was remeandered within its valley, and you can see in these dark shadows along the base of the hill, these large ponds where the old channel was plugged, and those ponds are now 5 feet deep and providing, you know, frog and turtle habitat. And the channel was remeandered through here and, you know, grew in over time. Next slide. And this is how it looked the next growing season. So really, you know, you have a meandering channel through here. Some of the bed needed to be armored somewhat and some wood added for complexity, but this channel, because of the excess shear stress and slope we had, but this channel narrows itself up over time and is able to provide, you know, a lot more stability and function on its own once it's got a well-connected floodplain. So next slide. So this brings us back to our concept of stormwater master planning and restoration master planning at the subwatershed scale, what we're trying to do with some of these systems. And like I said, there's really an economy of scale with some of these different streams. We're able to do more, and the cost per linear foot is less when you do this sort of analysis. And it really, you know, some of our streams have different funding sources. For example, if you're putting in a new road culvert that's perched, we can sometimes leverage that funding to get room, you know, to get funding for restoring the stream further downstream. In some cases, it's trails, it's other aspects of site design that we're able to leverage and implement over time. But like I said, in a lot of cases, when you're talking, several square miles, you can have multiple landowners, and getting their buy-in is kind of critical. And having a plan in place that can be implemented in phases is much more cost effective and provides a lot more benefit. And a lot of things that we're looking at now as well are daylighting some of these small headwater tributaries. We're looking at that and a few projects, and I think that's where it's going to be really critical to look at restoring this hyporheic zone in the stream bed throughout the entire valley, which we see in a lot of our more functioning streams further north. If we do soil borings in the valley, we find that same gravel layer where the stream was hundreds of years ago, and it's all interconnected fairly well. And the other practice that we've been using is where we have stormwater outfalls that are really eroding so that an end section falls in. We're using the concept of a step pool channel to rebuild that outfall at about the same price as it would be restoring the pipe, and creating a natural vegetated step pool channel system up to 4, 5, even 8% slope really provides some water quality benefits and uses the concepts of stream restoration to integrate that infrastructure. And the last slide. So, conventionally, there's a lot of things we did to try to control flooding, and now we're looking at the concept of natural flood management, where we're really trying to restore a stream corridor and integrate the green stormwater infrastructure into our site designs to provide multiple benefits rather than simply trying to control the flood peaks, and have that redundancy within the system that can really use natural processes much more effectively. I'm going to turn it over to Patrick, and we have a few minutes toward the end, hopefully, for some discussion. Haven't seen any questions yet.
Thanks, Rob. And I think what is just as he had indicated, the relationship to stream restoration, as well as the urban area, urban context, where we do have a lot of impervious service area, and we do get a lot of this flooding, as well as large storm events that are now contributing to a much greater quantity of water entering into these stream systems that start to get into the incising, and where we are losing the habitats as well as the vegetation in those areas. So what I'm going to do is go through some of those urban types of green stormwater infrastructure, where we start to think about ways in where we can better manage the stormwater so that we're able to manage it at the point in which the rain falls. And so therefore we're looking to cool, cleanse, and cool that water down before it enters into the water table, as it enters into the water table before it discharges into the stream. Next, please. So basically just want to try to get a better understanding, and going back to our basics in hydrology, is really understanding what we need to use as a model to design and engineer the green stormwater infrastructure technologies or practices. And that is, what was the historical hydrology patterns, where basically everything, for the most part, would infiltrate down to the water table, whether it would take days, months, or years. You still had that functionality where it cool, cleanse, and clean that water before it enters into the discharge point, whether it's a lake, a stream, or a river. Next slide, please. And so today we basically are looking at what we've done, and in which case we've disrupted that hydrological connection to those water bodies. And so whether it's through agriculture, through road building, altering the stream systems to straighten them out to be much more of a ditch system, because we always felt that the quicker we can get the water downstream became somebody else's problem and not theirs. And also just the urban context in which we do have a lot of that impervious surface area as well, and the continuing sediment discharge coming off the exposed land after agricultural practices and or construction for a new housing development. Next, please. So we do have problems still today with agriculture. There's a slight change in practices now that farmers are beginning to understand what it takes to keep the healthy soils on their land and being able to start thinking about practices such as cover crops and micronutrient injection into the soil, incorporating organic matter into the soil, because there you're able to hold more moisture into those soil profiles and when it rains, and so you get a saturation point that is a much longer process than a quick process where there's very little topsoil, very little organic matter. So it's also looking at green stormwater infrastructure at the agricultural scale too that helps to benefit those stream systems that are impacted by these large amounts of sediment flows in. And when you start to look at FSA records from only a few years ago and looking at 2 to 3 tons per acre per year of sediment loss or topsoil loss, it's still not good. We still have to look at better ways in which sustainable practices start to look at what we can do at the farm scale. Next, please. As you obviously have seen many times, is the old way of the conventional stormwater management, gray infrastructure, pipe it and push it down as fast as possible. Also created these these problems with our stream banks, basically eroding the land down, carrying the sediment with it, and causing the health of the stream system to be degraded. Next, please. And obviously, many of you here in Michigan have, and throughout the Great Lakes region in the Midwest, have understand the flooding issues that we currently are encountering because of the fact that we have much more of these intense storm events, more frequent rain events, and the system just can't keep up. And so now, just last year in Detroit, we had two back-to-back 500-year storm events within a 2-week process. And so within a two-week time frame. So, they're looking at a much more aggressive approach to how we can get managing the stormwater under control. Next, please. So again, thinking about the hydrological patterns and incorporating that type of design criteria into the green stormwater infrastructure practices is what we want to try to do, is replicate the hydrology as much as we possibly can. Next, please. So one of those things, one of our colleagues and mentor actually came up with this botanical law. And that is, if you change the hydrology, you change the plants in which you grow into those ecosystem site. So rather than what you want to be able to do is replicate that hydrology as much as you possibly can to bring back that plant ecosystem system back into a situation where it's a much more stable system over time, and it's not much dynamics going on as far as the flash floods and also the sediment loads. So again, if you change the hydrology, you change the plant and the inhabitants in which it grows. Next, please. So it's a living system approach that we look at from a design standpoint, and we look at nature as part of that understanding. So she's been at it for quite a long time, so it's a matter of understanding how her processes is, looked at adaptation, resiliency, because it was evolving changes that occurred over longer periods of time, but it's also one in which she was able to begin to understand and balance those systems to be a much more diverse system and much more appreciated by us as the humans that are part of those systems. Next, please. So we want to be able to optimize the design, and that is being able to create a situation where we're looking at a design that replicates nature as much as possible, is much more of a stable system, is a balanced system, and it has very biologically rich and diverse system, because that's where our appreciation, the aesthetics come from, in which we as humans begin to understand that it's the connection to nature that also begins to cool and calm ourselves and reduce our stress. It's one of the reasons we like to go out to the national parks or state parks, is because of that natural beauty that's out there. In which case, if we were to have that looking out our offices or our homes, those same type of natural systems, then it also becomes something we can live in over time. Next, please. Next, please. So it's also looking at regenerative design, and that is kind of the foundation of that is basically the concept that waste does not exist in nature. All aspects of waste are reused by some other organism that either takes that waste, converts it to energy, or converts it to some type of nutrient. So it becomes a situation as it's a closed loop system. So it's an understanding that in our designs, we want to be able to monitor to understand some of those feedback loops that actually begins to evolve the design in a different way and becomes a much more robust design and becomes much more of a stable and balanced system as well. Next, please. So climate resilience, and what I mean by that and what we look at is distributed and redundant systems. So rather than a site depending on one gray stormwater infrastructure system that is, a pipe and retention basin, is actually look at multiple opportunities where a green roof, a bioswale, rain garden, a permeable pavement might be multiple practices that are installed on a site that really starts to help to build in that redundancy so that if one system fails, at least some other system would be able to take over. So you want to be able to engineer those opportunities, and then also starting to look at co-benefits as a part of that resiliency. And a good example of that is green roofs, where you not only have the stormwater management systems, but you also are able to start to think about HVAC cooling costs and heating costs are reduced greatly. In some instances, we've seen factors up to 45 to 55% in energy savings for a building, such as the Chicago City Hall green roof that you see in the background of this picture. Next, please. And so obviously it's people and nature that's a part of these systems. And so that's where our health and well-being is most productive. Our community connections, our learning environments, all of that contribute to healthy living, work, and play spaces for all of us. And so it's a matter of understanding nature to be able to replicate, these nature-based designs that we want to live as a part of. Next, please. So one of those early type projects is the Kresge Foundation headquarters. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a kind of an oasis off of Big Beaver Road in Troy, Michigan, where this is a natural kind of landscape as well as a stormwater management system. So the ponds that the stormwater that discharges into the system is not only the prairie surrounding the headquarters itself, but also the system in which we're using the detention facility as part of the landscape. So you're viewing out to it and out into nature. So if you can imagine, this site is surrounded by nearly 700 car parking lot and office buildings, and then come to here and employees have actually observed fox in this landscape, as well as cranes and egrets as they fly by. Next, please. Part of that system is the permeable pavers as part of the parking lot, and then also starting to look at a cistern over on the left image there that stores a lot of that pumps up and stores a lot of that rainwater that is used then for the supplemental irrigation and also for the toilet flush, non-potable water use at that headquarters. Next, please. The next site is the Ann Arbor Municipal Center. We worked with several engineering firms as well as the architectural firm looking at where every drop of water that fell on the site would be treated on site at this location. And as a part of that, we started thinking about ways in which we can incorporate art and sculpture to be a part of that landscape to represent the value of water as it enters into the stream. So the sculptural image you see was designed by Herbert Dreiseidel, a German landscape architect. And a closer image later on, you'll see that that bronze color is to represent the soil. And in it are a couple of LED lights that are blue that represents the rainwater that's filtrating in through the soil profile. And the sinuous little form you see at the bottom represents the Huron River, which is connected hydrologically to that river system. And also we are, being able to embrace and celebrate rainwater in this system. Next slide, please. Part of that is this rain garden, and underneath that rain garden in the center there is about 20 feet deep cistern holding area with open grade aggregate as part of that backfill. And so we start to look at opportunities in which we can, like I mentioned, celebrate that rain. So what comes off the roof that is not captured by the green roof on the top of the city hall are this runoff that runs linear parallel to the rain garden, as well as these pans that collect the water and discharge into the rain garden itself. And you can kind of see what's happening over there in the upper right as far as a rain event taking place. And again, we're just bringing it out and exposing it as part of art and nature to celebrate. And the sculptural feature that's there by Herbert Dreiseidel as well. Next slide. And all the water that is coming from that sculpture actually is collected in a cistern as well. Here we're working with the Charles Wright Museum of African American History. So what we want to do is something similar. So with a master plan that's in place, we're looking at ways in which we can start to treat that stormwater that historically has discharged into storm pipes and then eventually discharge out into the Detroit River. In this instance, we want to be able to incorporate the permeable pavers, which is at the lower right-hand side there. And what we did was we looked at contrasting pavers, permeable pavers, as a part of that art system. And so in this instance, we worked with community groups, stakeholders to better understand, what would that feature be? And in this case, it's a Sankofa, which is a Dinka symbol from Guyana that represents about 40 different Dinka symbols that start to think about, as you go through life, there's, all of these wise words to follow. And in this instance is basically to go back and get it. And what that means is look back at your history in order to understand how you move forward to your future. And this, the beak of the bird that you can see in the pavers itself is pointed directly at the front door. And that was very deliberate by one of the community leaders, is because that's where your journey begins, is here at this museum. Next, please. The next phase, we took the old staff parking lot, which was all concrete, and over on the left image, you start to see where the new parking lot was installed that it uses permeable pavements as well as the staff entrance. And if you look a little closer, you can see where we use contrasting brick pavers that start to look at opportunities in which we never have to paint again, because those are the numbers for the assigned spaces as well as the parking space itself. So start to think about all the paint striping that's done in parking lots, roadways, and where does that paint go after it wears off? And it ends up into our storm system and eventually into our soils and sediment and into our streams. So this way they never have to use that paint striping again as part of the sustainability mission that they have. Next, please. Another project is over in Glendale, Wisconsin, Johnson Controls headquarters. In the lower left side, you can see a stream came through here that was actually piped. It became daylighted, and we restored the stream system in there, as well as collecting all the rainwater that's coming off the rooftop and being able to treat that in various practices, whether it's the permeable pavement parking lot in the upper right-hand corner, or some of the bioswales and rain gardens that are there on the campus also. Next, please. Part of the system is that natural landscape that's out there replicating the local historic pre-European settlement vegetation, which was a short grass prairie, the green roof that is out near the offices that the employees would be able to look out to and see nature, and then also the parking lot where it's all permeable pavers, as well as LED lighting that is a part of that system too, to start thinking about reducing the energy costs as part of addressing the change in our climate that we're starting to experience. Next, please. These are a couple of other images. In the larger image on the right, you can see back in the near the building is where the employee break area is, so they can look out over this natural landscape that's part of the stormwater management system, this detention facility. Again, just integrating some of those natural landscape features into it. They do have a solar array there to help supplement much of the energy that's used out at the site. They do keep a low mow, no mow mix of turf so that they can manage the growth beneath the panels themselves. And also the lower right is a 44,000 gallon cistern that's used as part of that non-potable water use, whether it's irrigation, toilet flush. But again, that is an underground system that's a part of the stormwater management of this campus. Next, please. Chicago Public Schools, again, we're looking at opportunities in which we can, in the urban context, it's a program, Space to Grow, that starts to look at, the urban schools K through 12, in which, if you can imagine, are probably not the most exciting setting for a playground when you start to think about nature as a part of the play. But in this instance, we were able to start thinking about stormwater management in a different way, again, looking at how ways in which we can embrace it and celebrate it. Next slide, please. In which case, what you see is this new playground. Just about everything you see other than the white concrete is infiltrated, even the play surface. It's a permeable rubberized material that allows infiltration into the open grade aggregate base that's down below. The tan color is basically some of those permeable pavers that are part of that stormwater system, as well as the running track off to the upper left. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before, this is kind of what their playground looked like. So it was just a matter of fence line to fence line of asphalt. And so being able to look at all the impervious surface and all that stormwater that collected all the junk and pollutants and sediment, and being able to collect that and put it into a storm drain down into a pipe down into the Chicago River. Now we're able to start thinking about stormwater in a different way. So next slide. These are some of the retention systems that are built into the playground underground. And so a lot of that is rather than going with your 21 AA limestone as a base, you start to look at open grade aggregate as far as that stormwater storage opportunity. So this is what is underneath the system that is part of the stormwater management. Next slide. Just an overall shot. There were part of the system was native plantings were installed as a part of the vegetation. Next slide, please. And in order to do that, we actually got the parents and students out there to be a part of the plantings. And when you start to show that they are doing the work effort, there takes a little bit more pride in the management and stewardship of that system by the community, because they were a part of the building of the stormwater system. And the the stone that you see in the bottom of that is part of the stormwater conveyance. So when we do get those tremendous storm events and it fills up the bioswale system there, it has a discharge point in the lower right-hand side. So this can still fill up, store the water, but then be able to infiltrate and settle back down to a more tamer bioswale. Next slide, please. Again, going back to where we start to think about, art and sculpture as part of the story or narratives, in which case, when you're drawing attention through art, you're starting to look at the personas of humans and human nature, whether it's the scientist in somebody, the engineer in somebody, or the arts and literature somebody. In this instance, the city of Ann Arbor was able to use FEMA funds where there were 3 home sites that were built in the floodway of Allen Creek, and using those funds, they were able to raise the buildings, excavate out the basements, and rather than backfilling the basements with regular soil and or fill material, we actually used kind of 3 feet of open grade aggregate as part of this system and built a rain garden on top of it. Part of the other narrative in the story is that Allen Creek, which is directly underneath this, is 2 60-inch storm pipes that discharge into the Huron River. And so part of that story was these are smallmouth bass fish that are swimming down to the Huron River. And part of the story is the cleaner, the cooler the water is, as well as the stability, is that it brings healthier habitats for the smallmouth bass here. Huron River is also known as the blue ribbon fisheries for the smallmouth bass. So it's a part of that story connection that we want to be able to incorporate, that doing your part on understanding what this is lends itself to a deeper understanding of why we're doing what we're doing for cleaning up our waters and our waterways and our systems. Next slide, please. And these are just some of the images throughout the season, so that we want to get multiple colors. They are native prairie systems, and so when you start to think about native prairie systems, it's also something that you want to think about from management and stewardship, because a lot of our native prairie system grasses and wildflowers are fire dependent. And so we actually do, next slide, do prescribed burning in the small little pocket park. And so that's something that is done on every 3rd year as part of a rotation. What that does is eliminates the warm season invasive species and starts to bring out the health of these prairie plants. And so what's also interesting now is that a lot of this is where the kids in the neighborhood have actually named the fish. There's 5 of these fish. So, Leonardo DiCarpia, or someone like a fish called Wanda or Carp Diem. And so every year there's a new name that is labeled on a little placard that's at the base of each one of these fish. Next slide, please. One of the last projects I'll be talking about is Richton Park Green Infrastructure Planning, and this is in Chicago, Illinois. The left image is kind of gives you an understanding of the hydrology, and then overlaying that onto the land use, which is the purple being the industrial office and the yellow being single family. So it was a matter of, now we're at these headwaters, these smaller streamlets, but at the same time, the development of this system has to be looked at much more carefully, because that is where we're going to start to have the issues and problems, as Rob has mentioned throughout his presentation, about how do we restore these stream systems. And if you can do it outside of the stream bed area, the stream bank area, it becomes a much more stable system. Next slide, please. So part of this is looking at the topography, the hydrology, and just starting to better understand the characteristics of the site and look for the optimization of where we have to apply our green stormwater infrastructure practices. And again, looking at not just one or two practices or technologies, but what's in our toolkit that we can make sense of, that is most applicable to the types of land uses that are going to be there. Next slide. So these are some of the images that we started to look at, where we incorporated the bioswales, the permeable pavements systems, the natural landscape, as these light industrial uses came in. And this was a situation where we built before all phases were, even before the first phase was started, some of the perimeter type detention facilities were built first, so that as each one came online, they would be able to accommodate those stormwater discharges into those basins. But at the same time, again, we're treating where we can, whether it's the green roof or the other practices, as I mentioned before. Next slide, please. This is just kind of a close-up of some of those sub areas where we start to look at, again, what we can do to best manage the stormwater where it falls, and being able to treat it where it falls before it ultimately gets to the stream itself through the water table. Next slide, please. This is just another example of another area of a different land use. So in this instance, we're, using 4 of those types of practices that we felt were best suited for this type of development or this land use in this portion of the development. Next slide, please. And that wraps it up for us, and we are open to questions if you want to put them into the chat box. We're open to, if you've got we got time, so if you have a question, you can also unmute and be able to let us know. And it looks like
Patrick,
it
looks like there's, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Depending on the practice itself, what we like to do is be able to have some type of a sediment trap prior to it entering into any of the stormwater practices. So if it's a bioswale, and let's say it's being fed from a street roadway, is that the spillway itself, what we like to do is have it depressed a little bit so that that area starts to collect the sediment, in which case, whether it's on a annual basis or at least 2 or 3 times a year, you would want to be able to get in there and clean that sediment out. And what we typically like to think about is, if the staff or the maintenance crew is out there with a square tip shovel, is that whatever we designed is actually able to accommodate that square tip shovel. If you get into some of the chamber systems, there's usually the underground chambers, which maybe beneath a parking lot, is that there's usually a catch basin or sump system that's able to collect that sediment before it gets into the chambers, which also will be setting on open grade aggregate itself too. So what you want to try to do is try to capture that surface runoff system in some type of pre-treatment or even a secondary treatment system. You would have to go into, with the chamber system or even with some of the permeable paver systems, we do include a clean out where that sediment is trapped, and use a vac to be able to vacuum it up. For permeable pavers, you have to think about the return on investment first and start to think about the operational costs. We starting to see where permeable pavers can last up to 40 to 50 years. Because you've actually eliminated the freeze-thaw heaving and settling because of the open grade aggregate. There's no moisture that's being held in the base material. Where the sediment does collect is on that surface aggregate, which is a much smaller one. And so typically you want to either sweep that or use a vacuum, which actually is a very low pressure vac. So it's only sucking up the first 1/4 inch and then replenish the fill stone in between there. Sometimes that would be on an annual basis, depending on, how much sediment you feel you're getting, or it could be on a 3-year rotation, but it's really going to be a matter of, the site factors that influence how much sediment gets into those areas. So again, it's just a matter of trying to look at pre-treatment systems before it gets into the open grade aggregate, if that answers your question there, Dallas. Have any more questions? If you can also raise your hand and we can point to somebody. Great. No questions. Either we answered everything or.
Yeah.
But great. Well, we have this presentation has been recorded, and we can send it to those who have an interest and those who have registered to be able to take a look at it. And we appreciate your attendance and look forward to maybe seeing some of you again in our future webinars.
Yeah, I think we'd appreciate some feedback. I know that Catherine may help us send out some sort of survey to do some follow-up, see how we could do better next time, and also see what the interest is on related topics, maybe in the fall. So we appreciate some feedback. That would be great.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.